Okay, cool. All right. So first of all, thank you so much for and congratulations to IWCON 2023 for having me here, to Sai and to Anangsha and to everyone who helped this conference to be more effective. And I really love your initiative of having all these students coming in together and then just to learn from the people who's going to speaking on this conference. And again, shout out to some of my unit GG members who's watching right now all the way from the Philippines. And let's start our discussion. So right now, I'm going to discuss everything related to ransomware and how can we detect and how can we respond on such attacks. But before we start, I actually created a poll that I will be publishing right now. So it's up to you if you can answer it right now or maybe in the middle of the conversation. So this is just a very quick one, Paul. Like, have you experienced being a victim of a ransomware attack? All right. Okay. So while you guys answering that, Paul, let me just move on and introduce myself. I'm working on a team called Unit 42. So Unit 42 is the threat intelligence and incident response team under Palo Alto Networks. So we publish blog. We're the one who's responding to every incident to our global clients. And even though you guys are not being infected by any incidents, we're also doing a lot of proactive approach, doing compromise assessment, doing purple teaming, doing a security architectural review of your infrastructure. And a part of my contributions to the community is that we also, and me and my team from Guidem, created multiple courses that we offer online. We actually started in the Philippines, and then right now we do have almost 15 students around the globe. So very proud of that accomplishments. And I've been teaching them and also an instructor of specifically for the blue team courses. And lastly, I'm also part of the team called the DFIR report. So for those people who's doing incident response there, doing malware analysis and digital forensics, I think maybe you've heard about the DFIR report. So we are a collective group based on our specialties. Primarily, all of us are incident responder. And we publish reports publicly so that people can at least have some knowledge on how they can perform some intrusion analysis into different aspects of incidents. And again, last but not the least is being a member of a Hackstreet Boys is I'm very grateful of it. So Hackstreet Boys is a CTF team based in the Philippines who's been competing on a global stage for the past few years. And I have here my Twitter. If you want to keep in touch, even right after this conference, then hit subscribe and follow me on my Twitter handle here. And let's get things started, right? So based on my topic about ransomware, this is exactly one of the main incidents that we encountered on a daily basis. So almost every day, there's 5, 6, and 10 incidents that we encounter. Clients calling us, or sometimes one of the insurance firm in US and also in in Europe calling us because of their clients are getting hacked. And these are some classifications of the different types of incidents that we encountered so far. As you can see, that 29.2% here is all about extortion and ransomware. And then 23.5 is all about BEC, or what we call business email compromise. And then the third one was the network intrusion. But our main topic here is all about the extortion or the ransomware infection that keeps on growing. And up until now, there's a lot of massive improvement when it comes to the ransomware as a service ecosystems. Now, we have here a data. We haven't published it yet, but we're about to publish it in the Q1 next year, wherein we collect all of the incidents that we gather for the past year. And we started having some data statistics of everything, especially for the MTTE, or the median time to exfiltrate. So these are the days that it takes for a ransomware once they get into the systems, and then how long does it take for them to get your data and then perform data exfiltration. So you may notice on 2021, it takes them around 9 days before they exfiltrate the files coming from your internal infrastructure. And then around 2022 to 2023, that's going to be less than 2 days. All right, so there's a massive improvement coming in there. And then right now, it only takes them hours. So let's say once they get into the systems, they will perform a lot of enumerations, discovery of what are your critical servers. Once they get into those critical servers, they will try to perform credential dumping, lateral movement. They'll try to stage all your data, compress all your files, and then exfiltrate it to their C2 channel or into their infrastructure. And those different phases might take them only a few hours to have those data being stolen coming from your insider network or into your inside network. So that is something that actually very shocking to us. So after they get those data, all those exfiltrated data, what are they going to do next? They can encrypt your files. So after they stole those data, they will now try to run all their ransomware binaries, and then they will try to encrypt your files. Once those files have been encrypted, then you will receive a lot of ransom notes into your infrastructure, into your servers, into your workstations, and then you may notice that you've been affected by this thing called ransomware. Right, so data theft is something that they're going to do upon analyzing all those data that have been exfiltrated coming from your network. And then they will also perform harassment. We've seen a lot of harassment coming from ransomware operators. Sometimes if the client doesn't really care and they don't contact the ransomware operator trying to pay them, they will try to start sending an email to your key clients and also to your employees. Right, so they will just tell. Sometimes they will also call the media that, hey, this big company from Europe, from North America, from Asia has been hacked, and then they're not disclosing it to the public yet. All right, that creates a massive impact to your reputation as a company owner. And then once you still ignore all these things, then they will also perform denial of service. They will try to DDoS your website. They will try to DDoS all of your subsidiaries and your infrastructure so that you cannot operate anymore. Right, so that's a bit of like a massive distraction, because a lot of companies now are relying into their online systems, their web servers. And then if your web servers or your website is not functioning well, especially for the bank, then there's a lot of huge loss of money that you have to take there. And then lastly is the financial event loss. So for example, there's a company and then you try to acquire the company, and then the day before you announce that there's like a merging and acquisitions that's going to happen soon, then they will try to release your data to the public that, hey, we are successful on getting some files coming from this company. And then that would impact especially the big tech companies who's having public traded companies who's monitoring all their stacks. And then if that happens, then that is a huge impact to both of your mother company as well as to the company that you're about to acquire. All right, so this is what we call like a quadruple extortion, because these things are really happening from different perspective, and not just for the small businesses, but also to the tech and also to the large companies that you might have heard of. All right, so when it comes to, since this talk is all about detections and response, so it's going to be like a bit of like technical topics here, where there's a different phases, what are the different tools, and then how can we respond, and then how can we analyze such phases. Always starts with initial access. What are the top initial access vectors that we encounter if there is a ransomware attack? Most of the time, there is a software vulnerabilities involved. So let's say there is a vulnerability from a Citrix server or maybe to the ESXi environment. Sometimes there's also a vulnerability when it comes to your existing VPN products. So they will try to exploit that and then try to gain access coming from that exploited servers. If you can remember Log4j, proxy logon, those are things that are commonly used. And up until now, there are companies that are still not patching these vulnerabilities. And that's why ransomware actors still getting access to those systems. There's also some third-party vendors who keeps on having these sometimes 0 day, like Zoho Managed Engine, which is a bit of like a famous when it comes to initial access vector of ransomware. And again, up until now, there's like a Log4j and Log4Shell vulnerabilities that we've seen with our clients. After having some software vulnerabilities, there's also some instances that we notice that they try to brute force the some of your servers, especially your RDP servers that is exposed to the internet, SQL server that is exposed to the internet. They try to exploit, they try to brute force that to gain access to your credentials, and then that's how they get into your environment. Especially an Exchange server that doesn't implement MFA or multi-factor authentication. That is something that you need to think about if you're not still applying to FA in your environment. And then still phishing. All right, so phishing is not really new to us. It's been everywhere, and years ago, this has been like the most initial access vector that we can see, and up until now, there are still victims of this. I think 2 months ago, I responded into a ransomware operator called Black Pasta, and then this is their favorite way to get into the systems via phishing link. Wherein there is a phishing link, and then an employee tried to click that, and then that would automatically download an initial loader or a malware, and then that would start the whole conversation. Right. So I have a couple of examples down here, but before that, this is how we can detect these kind of attacks. Okay, so whenever there is a software vulnerabilities, then we always advise our clients to have a proper vulnerability assessment program, because on that program or um, on that particular techniques, then we can be able to detect what are those vulnerabilities that are still existing into our environment. If you know Microsoft Patch Tuesday, then hopefully you take it very seriously, because we don't want to be blamed when something happened into our environment. You should also check for a massive exploitation that's happening from the wild. We should keep up of what's happening, like try to go to Twitter, try to look for every different Infosec news, because every time that there is a massive exploitation happening on the internet, there's a lot of blogs, a lot of tweets that we can see. So make sure that your security team is very updated into those instances. When it comes to brute forcing the credential attack, make sure that we have some threshold. For example, in just few seconds, there are like 1,000 or 10,000 massive failed logon attempts, then that should have an equivalent of a group policy, wherein you probably lock an account that is being used when trying to log in, some sort of that kind of defense. When it comes to analysis as an IR, then you should look for specific event IDs such as 4624, which is an event ID whenever someone is trying to authenticate wrongly. There's also a trend wherein we found that there's a lot of SQL server that is exposed to the internet, and then there is also an event ID whenever there's someone is trying to access the SQL instance from external or from internal, and then that also creates a specific event ID if it was successful or if it was not. Later on, I have an example for that. For the phishing, I think a lot of the companies are using Office 365 right now. So when we're trying to investigate a phishing campaign, especially for the Office 365 environment, we typically look for a log called Unified Access Logs, or UAL. So make sure that your license is capable of extracting the UAL logs, because this is a very, very important thing when it comes to analyzing phishing attack or anything very unusual when it comes to your Office 365 ecosystem. If you have a proxy logs, then make sure that you also leverage that. And also every user activities, for example, they receive a couple of attachments that doesn't look like usual or very unusual, that they receive an attachment called .iso file, or maybe a .js file, which is a JavaScript, or maybe a .executable. So hopefully all of your default settings are actually blocking it. So this is an example of a real case that I handled last year, wherein when I tried to look for the initial access, so this is actually an event logs coming from an SQL server that is exposed to the internet. And then I got a tip that this could be a possible patient zero. So when I tried to look for event logs, I noticed that there's like a huge spike on the event ID 18456, because that gives me an idea that there's a lot of failed authentication attempt from this SQL box. And then you may notice that there you go, there's like a 42,000 that's having an that trying to attempt, or 42,000 attempts that I found on this MS SQL server trying to brute force different accounts, especially the SA account, right? And then this is now an example of an ISO file that is being mounted And there was also a trend last year and up until this year wherein ISO file was used to perform initial access. So they're just gonna send a link to the user, and then once you visit that link, then that would automatically download an ISO file coming from, let's say, a Google Drive, like looks to be a legitimate website. And then once you mount it, like say you are a non-tech person or a user, and then once you mount that ISO file, that actually includes a lot of malware and also a malicious file. And so if you're curious of what's going to happen if someone tries to mount it, then that's going to be under my next slide. But for the analysis, you should check also an event log channel called Microsoft Windows VHDMP file. All right, so not everyone knows about it, but every time that you're about to mount a certain file, like let's say ISO file, then that actually logs into a VHDMP file log channel. So hopefully this could be a good detection opportunity for you if you're not tracking this within your environment. Okay, so let's say we mount it. All right, I did mount it into my test machine. And then what would happen is that I have three files here, but the first and the third file are actually both hidden files. All right, so I just enable my settings into my Windows folder to show all those hidden files. But technically, if a user doesn't know this, he would only or she would only see a document with a PNG file. But this PNG file contains a shortcut file. All right, so it doesn't really make sense. If this is a PNG file, then a typical user would just open it without anything, without any thinking that this is malicious or not. But if you see that this is a PNG file but it has a type of shortcut, then could be like someone's trying to trick us, trying to masquerade a picture, but technically this is a shortcut file or what we call an LNK file. So what I did was I tried to look for the properties of this PNG file, as you can see on my screen, and then you can see on the target that once someone tries to click this PNG file, that will trigger a cmd.exe. That would open up this 40060, which actually a PNG file again like this one. But also, if you scroll it to the right, you can see that it will also trigger a run DLL that will call out this DLL file. And then that DLL file is actually an ICE ID malware, which is a common malware that was used to perform an initial loader as part of the ransomware techniques. And then if you try to look for the PNG, when you try to investigate it as an incident responder, you can actually see the whole command line parameter down here. So this is what I'm saying. Run DLL32 calls out the malicious DLL, which is happen to be like an ICE ID malware. Right, so this is a common thing that we can see so far based on the trends that we handled from our customer perspective. All right, so after they gain access to the system, then they will try to perform an internal discovery of your servers. What are the open ports? What are the open IP or what are the live IP addresses that they can try to get access into? Okay, so we have different tools here. And you may notice that these are actually legitimate tools that are commonly used by the enterprise, but these are heavily abused by the threat actors nowadays. Things like Anydesk. I've seen a lot of companies who's actually using Anydesk as part of their approved software, especially system administrator to perform troubleshooting. Advanced IP scanner, this was also being used by a lot of system admin just to know if the IP is alive or not. And also ADFind, which is a free tool to perform some sort of Active Directory enumeration. And NetScan, Nmap, these are all known network discovery tools. So look for these artifacts. If these are the tools that are not really approved by the company that you're trying to help for, then might as well look for these behaviors and what are the executions path of these tools. This is an example of an ADFind on action. So you can see that the threat actor dropped ADFind into the temp folder, and then it performs a lot of enumerations when it comes to your Active Directory. Things like it gets your computer information, the person or the user itself, and the OU, organizational unit, as we call it. And they also put a 7.exe, which is in 7-zip, wherein they try to zip all the files, all the outputs that is being produced by the ADFind. When it comes to lateral movement, all right, so let's say they gain access to the system, they were able to perform enumerations within the whole network, then they will try to hop in from one place to another, and that's what we call lateral movement. Again, there's also a lot of legitimate tools that you can see on my screen, and then these are very, very common when it comes to ransomware operators like P-Link, Screen Connect, Splashtop, Anydesk. These are actually what we call RMM, or remote management tools that heavily used by the corporate, again, heavily abused by the threat actors. So this is a very good mind map from a friend of mine, Vikas, if you're watching. Thanks for this mind map. So Vikas made a remote access software mind map wherein he created, or he put all together those commonly tools that's used by the ransomware or the threat actors, and then how can you perform forensic investigations once these tools have been executed within your environment. All right, that leaves a lot of traces. There might be event logs, there might be an artifact like a log file, or maybe a history or a config file. Once you run all of these softwares, then these are maybe the guide that you can use for you to look for maybe an IP addresses, or maybe the user that was used, or maybe the geolocation of the threat actor who's using this into your environment. So you can use this, and then I'll just put the link here so that you can also use this as well. This is an example of someone trying to masquerade a tool called P-Link. So as you can see that I found a binary called systems.exe, and then when I try to look it into the command line parameter, this is actually a P-Link. Okay, so P-Link acts like a PATI. If you know what PATI is, we use this to connect into different systems using SSH port 22, but this can also be heavily used by the threat actor to access your server. And this is what we call causality chain in the Cortex XDR world. You can see here the command line parameter that he uses also. Port 3389 down here, and then it reveals also the IP address of the threat actor, which, by the way, is actually coming from Russia on this instance. So there is also a tool called Screen Connect, and then when you try to look for the event logs of Screen Connects, most of the time it reveals the source IP of the threat actor if they use Screen Connect as part of their lateral movement. As you can see down here, this is an event ID on the application logs wherein it reveals the IP address of the threat actor. So again, what I'm trying to say here is that there are so many ways for us to defend, for us to detect all these artifacts, all this information whenever this is being used against into our environment. Now, talking about command and control. So these are some of the list of the command and control, or C2 tools, that we have encountered heavily used by the threat actors. Number one here is CobbleStrike. So this is a legitimate tool that we use. We use a lot, especially the offensive security folks. But there was a leak that was uploaded in VirusTotal, in some other forums underground, and they used that leaked version of CobbleStrike to use into a badness, or into their massive operations attacking different organizations. There's also a Havoc. It was created by C Spider, the guy from Vienna. I think he's like 16, 17 years old now. Metasploit is still being used. There's still a couple of threat actors who still use Metasploit. They bundle their binary, their payload into a PDF and into any other files that can easily be double-clicked by the user. There's also a BruteRatel, or what we call BRC4. This was created by a guy who works before from Mandiant, CrowdStrike, and then now he started his own company. And his goal is to create a very non-OPSEC friendly kind of tool wherein the majority of these tools are mainly for OPSEC purposes, like not to be detected, very become stealthy when it comes to the red team operations using this particular tool. There was also a leak version of it, so we've seen a lot of incidents as well wherein BruteRatel was used as part of their C2. And there's also a sliver. There was an APT threat actor called Agrius. Agrius APT, who's actually coming from Iran, who attacks Israel a lot of times. So we've seen that this threat actor uses Sliver as their C2 because their main reason of using different versions of C2 instead of just CobbleStrike is that a lot of EDR vendors, security solutions nowadays, having detections if ever you put CobbleStrike as part of your operations. So it can be easily detected, but by analyzing or by using different tools, then there could be an options for them, and maybe it's harder to be detected if they use a non-popular tool such as CobbleStrike. And then Octopus C2 also, there's an APT coming from China who actually used Octopus C2 in one of our cases. So shout out to my friend who actually created Octopus, so Muhammad Askar, used to work with him. Anyway, so when we try to reverse some of the Golang binaries that we found, we can see that this is an example of a different functions wherein a sliver was used as part of the C2. There was also a very great blog from Zscaler when Havoc was used as part of their operations. So I'll put the link down here just in case you're very interested to look and to know what happened on this incident. We also published year 2021. Our team from the DFI report published a very great blog when it comes to CobbleStrike, a defender's guide. There's like part one here, and then there's also a part two. So if ever you're curious on how you can detect CobbleStrike from an incident response standpoint, from the digital forensics standpoint, what are the logs, what are the event logs, how does it looks like from a network pickup perspective, I highly recommend you to look for and to read this blog. So I'll mention it down here. When it comes to data exfiltration, so let's say they perform lateral movement, initial access, credential dumping, and now they're trying to exfiltrate your data. They still use a lot of tools, a lot of websites that you can see on my screen to perform this attack. Normally, Megasync, there's also a tool called rclone, which is this one, heavily used to collect all the files that has been compressed and then send it into whatever they want. It could be an S3 bucket, it could be an Azure blob, or it could be a Mega Sync account. When we also try to have some incident related to our cloud, we noticed that there's a weird SVC host running on a temp folder. And then when we try to look what is this all about, then we can see that this is actually our cloud. All right, so threat actor loves to masquerade a certain binary, trying to be like a legitimate Windows core binary, but in the end, you can see that this is actually just being renamed, and this is basically an rclone binary. Right, so once you try to look for the rclone artifacts, then you can actually see what are the files that is being uploaded, because there is a log file that you can use as part of your investigation. And now you may notice that WinSCP was part of the tool that I've just discussed, because WinSCP creates, or it really performs so many things, especially WinSCP is a very well-known system admin tool. You can download, you can upload certain files into your remote IP address, into your remote server. And we try to look it into the forensic way of things. Like what are the artifacts? For example, the threat actor used WinSCP against my environment. What are the logged files that we can try to look for us to understand what happened or how did they use it to my network? Right. So whenever you try to run WinSCP, there is an INI file, which is a config file. And then I try to recreate it so that I would understand better. So when I try to open the WinSCP.ini file here, you can see that this is my user account. And then this is my IP address. And then there's like a hex down here. When I try to decode the hex strings from that INI file, you can see that these are the folders that I tried to visit it as me acting as the attacker on this instance. So basically, you can use this to track down what are the directories that have been touched by the threat actor by just decoding the hex that you can see on that INI file. So things like, the threat actor went to documents folder, the toolkit, he went to the desktop, exfil data, etc. And then also on that WinSCP.ini file, there is also a history. All right. So when you try to use WinSCP, there is like a search box on the right hand corner of WinSCP GUI, and then you can actually search different files based on the strings that you want. For example, the threat actor loves to see sales, password, or PASS, DB, or PW, or bank credentials, SSH keys. These are the common keywords that they try to look on a certain file because these might contain a sensitive information or maybe a password or maybe a financial reports. Those can be revealed when you look for that winscp.ini file and then look for configuration history mask. And then this is what I did. I tried to simulate that. And then these are exactly the keywords that I use for me when I'm trying to look for the files that I'm about to exfiltrate. So heavily recommend to look for that winscp.ini file. And cloud storage. So now we're living in a world where there's a lot of cloud storage that are being used by a common user: Google Drive, Dropbox, Box, Mega, OneDrive, iCloud. So there's a lot of artifacts that you can use whenever these particular legitimate tools are used against your environment. When a threat actor tries to leverage one of these, I had a talk in DEF CON, Blue Team Village, wherein it's actually on YouTube, so you can look for this talk, and then maybe if you're very curious of what are the artifacts that you can use for you to investigate it further, then there's a huge discussion on this talk. Now, this is the fun part. So I'm going to talk about the real world incident. So I think I have a few minutes left. So I'm going to use my remaining time for me to discuss a very fun case wherein I was part of the incident response team who actually solve and respond into a scenario wherein one of our clients got hit by 3 different ransomware. Number 1 is the Vice Society. Second is Black Hat. And then third is Ransom House, or sometimes Mario ransomware threat actor, in just a matter of 3 months. All right. So imagine, you are working in a company and then you're like a security guy over there. And then suddenly you got hit by the first ransomware. After a few months, you got hit by another ransomware. And then after a few days, you got hit by third ransomware threat actor. So I'm going to show you some of the tools, some of the malware that they use for them to navigate on this case, and possibly the lessons learned after that. All right, so here's the background of the client. So due to the NDA, I cannot just disclose anything that can correlate and attribute to the client, but just to give you an overview of how does it looks like from the technical perspective, what are their tech stack, and then how many endpoints do they have. So they have a bit of tech stack, like they have antivirus, they have firewall, they have also backup, SIEM. They don't have SIEM, they don't have EDR, but they do have MSSP, like a third-party vendor who's actually looking into their infrastructure, different alerts, firewall logs, etc. Right? They have 4,000 Windows endpoints, a mid-sized environment, and also 30 plus Linux without Mac. And again, they got hit by 3 different ransomware. All right, so this is the timeline. All right, this was last year. So October 27th, they got hit by a ransomware called the Vice Society. Second, after a few months, on December 14th, they got hit by Black Cat. And then after a few days, just 3 days, they got hit by another ransomware, which is Ransom House, and it got infected their file servers as well as their domain controllers. Okay, and after that, that's the time where our team got engaged. All right, so whenever we're doing some incident response, we typically start our conversation through the use of scoping calls, right? We're going to hop into the Zoom call, and then we'll try to ask them so many questions, like literally what happened to your environment? When was the first time that you know that you got hit by a certain attack? So these are just the timeline, all right? So what happened after the first incident? The management decided to terminate everyone who's working on the IT. They tried to hire another new manager. And then after a few weeks being a new manager within the company, then they got hit by another ransomware. They called the FBI, and then FBI was on the scene. But after just a few days, they got hit again by third ransomware, which is very sad at that point. Okay, so when we try to do a kickoff, then we assemble the team and then try to analyze every single things that we can see on their on the environment, we deployed our XDR, which is the Cortex that we normally use when it comes to the incident response for every incident response engagements that we have. And then this is what we saw so far. All right. As part of the initial access, or what we call the patient zero, there was a lot of exposed RDP servers that we found on their network. And then there was 80,000 attempts that we saw on the service using a service account called SQL admin. There was also successful logins coming from an external IP using the SQL admin as the service account. And we believe that that was the reason how this threat actor get into the system. After a few hours, they were able to navigate into the ntds.dit file, which is a very sensitive database that you can find into your domain controller later on that part. We also found untitled.ps1, which is a PowerShell script that is related to a tool called Session Gupper. This is a PowerShell script that collects all the save remote access that you have, particularly on your browser. So for example, a user keeps on saving their credentials into the browser. There's a lot of tools that you can use for you to grab that easily. But this is a custom tool, a PowerShell script that can easily just run and then grab all those information to be used, and to be abused. Now, this is me when I was trying to investigate within this exact incident, and I was having some panda bear over there. So I tried to look for the domain controller, right? So, and then what I found was that this threat actor tried to back up the ntds.dit file into a folder called temp_logs, which is very unusual. Sometimes system administrator creates a scheduled task to perform this, but it's very unusual that someone put it into like a very unsecure directory such as temp logs. And then that's how I tried to pivot and so many things. So whenever you're trying to investigate a domain controller, that would be like a massive logs, then try to look for event ID. These are all on their application logs, event ID 327, 325, and 216. So these are some of the database engine that creates a database because the TA run the ntdsutil.exe, which is a binary that was used to control the ntds.dit file. But in this case, they try to abuse it, and they try to brute force and crack all these passwords that you can find on the ntds.dit for a lot of purposes. Right? So that's how we pivot and navigate on the domain controller side. We also found another PowerShell script called ADPs. So this is a collection of different tools against Active Directory, perform enumeration. It can also perform ADCS attack, like the Active Directory certificate services. It gets all the CA name, the CA server, the vulnerable templates. It also gets some of the credentials. It can also perform Kerberos roasting, so on and so forth. So this is a collective approach, collective framework that a threat actor can use against your Active Directory environment. All right, so I think I've discussed most of this, like the advanced port scanner, Angry IP scanner, NetScan. So these are all tools that can be used to perform scanning throughout your organizations when it comes to your network, when it comes to the users, and also to the open ports and live IP addresses that they can find. And it's not just that, like a software or a NetScan can actually use Telnet or files FTP, or it can also run PSExec. So it's not just to scan the whole environment, but NetScan can also use to perform a remote access to the machines that they want. So on this one, I said that there was another PowerShell script called w.ps1. So this is, again, a custom PowerShell script that was used by the threat actor to collect, again, browser history, anything that is being saved into your browser. And then it also collects the computer name, username, and what are the tools or what are the applications that were installed into your system. So it's more of getting some more information for every machines where they run this PowerShell script. As part of lateral movement, there is a favorite tool of these threat actors called PSExec. PSExec is a legitimate tool from Microsoft, from Sys internal suite, but we found out that they've also used PSExec to move laterally within the environment. You can see that there's a lot of versions wherein PSExec was dropped into different directories, such as program data, downloads folder, and then also desktop PS tools. And then we can also see a lot of PS remoting. So this is where they access different machines using PS remoting through PowerShell. They also use AnyDesk and like the OG MSTSC.exe. Once you try to run it, then it would open up an RDP connection or RDP GUI wherein you can remote any systems that you want as long as you have access. This is an example where we found AnyDesk was used. So based on the statistics, 51 endpoints was used, and 51 endpoints contains AnyDesk.exe within their environment. So this is also being abused by the threat actor. All right, every time that someone tries to use AnyDesk, there is a lot of traces and logs that we can use for us to detect them. Some of it were based on AD trace. So AD trace can be found under app data folder, AnyDesk, and then you can see that this is just a text file. And then you can identify some of the logon events, some of the log of events, and file transfer whenever a threat actor used AnyDesk into your environment. Right, so that's a big one. And then there's also an AD_service.trace. This can also be used to trace those logon and log of events based on AnyDesk. And there's also connection_trace.text. So again, these are artifacts that we heavily use whenever someone's trying to use AnyDesk or threat actor use AnyDesk within our client environment. There's also a backdoor that was used here. So this main.dll, so upon performing reverse engineering into it, we found out that this was used by a tool, by a team called Vice Society. So they've coded this as a malware called Port Starter. So a malware that was used to modify the firewall settings to allow certain ports such as port 3389 or RTP. Sometimes they also allow a port 22 so that it won't hinder their operations. Right. So if you go to VirusTotal, if you look into the hash of that file, then you can see that it was actually a known one. This is what also we found, like there's another SVC host.exe lurking around not within the system32 folder. And then that's very unusual. This should be under system32 folder. If you found like an SVC host running any other directory such as temp, downloads, or maybe app data, then there's a high chance that that is a malicious one. It turns out that this is actually a malicious SVC host because when we try to look into it, especially from this behavior standpoint, once you execute SVC host.exe, that actually performs a PowerShell executions, and then it connects into this particular IP. And then when you try to look for VirusTotal, this is a very well-known IP address related to Cobalt Strike. Okay, so this could be the beacon that they use to connect back to their command and control channel. One thing that we also look for when we are investigating a lot of PowerShell executions is an artifact called PS readline. So when we try to look into it, you may notice what are the different commands that they've run using that PowerShell terminal once they get access to the system. So we collect this at scale. So when we're performing incident response, we typically perform it at scale. And then once we parse it, you can see that a lot of binaries are being used here. Like for example, 0dom.txt